I now have better audio. All right. Visual Studio Code. File open. Let me just go to, which cohort are you again? May 7th. Well, it very well may be. Okay. New folder, advanced. So, I'm going to take a quick poll of everyone who was here, which apparently we're missing. Matt. That's Matt.
Sorry,
Aaron.
I was associated.
Fair enough. So we're missing one half of Marin. If that's your couple name. I will say that we frequently have, if you look at anyone's schedule in Lighthouse, frequently there are set meetings between two people, and what'll happen is that they will. Let me create something for Redux 1, and what'll happen is that they will. The regular meeting name will be like a combination of their names, like one would have a couple name. So it's kind of an ongoing joke. Like, for instance, when Rosie would have an ongoing meeting with Remy or Remington. Is that first name Remington? So that one would show up just as Rosington. And I think now it's going to be Davington, right? And so I was going to have a meeting with Davey, and he's like, well, what's our couple name? And we ended up with Billy Jolvie. So I could live with that. Yeah, so Redux.
You were going to take a poll or something.
Yes, I was going to take a poll. So there are kind of 3 lectures that I wanted to put together. One of them was basically Redux 1 and 2. And another one was on CSS layouts using float, grid, flexbox, absolute positioning. Who would rather that I just do Redux Part 1 and 2, knowing that Redux Part 1 and 2 will be days apart?
So
Or
I would like Redux.
okay, so just more Redux, MOAR Redux. Okay.
I feel like CSS would be pretty useful, but Redux
Right.
is new enough to be like.
Okay. Cool. All right, Redux Part 1. Then what this is going to be is going to be a little more about React state management plus intro to Redux. And when I talk about state management, I'm kind of talking about state management in the large, like in kind of what it means to manage state. I think one of the things that Redux has been really great about is because it has such a strict model about what to do with that state, and it doesn't help you out. Dealing with it gives you a good idea of like, well, this is what it's like to deal with state. So I'm going to start with 2 things. One is that state is an instantaneous snapshot of the current app. All right? So that any given state is where the app is right now. Not, oh, it's like if you have an async thing happening, it's not what it is on both sides of that, right? The state is where the state is now. And then the state is where the state is now, and the it's synchronous, so it's instantaneous. It's kind of like, yeah, it's synchronous. It can be kind of operated on synchronously. It has no asynchronous parts. It's just, bam, it's what's happening now. And it may contain 2 types of data. I've kind of given some of this before. We're just kind of giving them to contextualize. So when I say 2 types of data, here's what I mean. Good heavens, there's so much stuff here. I was doing a lot of OAuth stuff over the weekend. I don't think I meant to close that one. Oh well. Okay, so let me go to Collect UI. Let me choose crowdfunding campaign car interface. Yeah, sure. Let's do that. Do I want to do that? Analytics chart. Okay, let's do this. This is a good example. Okay, so let's view on Dribble. All right, so let's look at this for a moment. There are two types of information being represented here, or two types of information we have to keep hold of to make this work. The first is the data, right? And data might belong in some data source somewhere. There's a database that says 90.2, or some data source. That might be like a query from a database, but that represents what the actual data is, right? There is there's a person named Daniel Larson who is in Saint-Denis or from Saint-Denis or works for the company Saint-Denis, right? And they posted something on May 26th that had this, and there's 22 comments, right? That is the data. Does that make sense? Right? But then there's also some stuff here that is, so one thing about the data is that it belongs somewhere else. It belongs on another computer, is another way to think of that, right? It belongs you can get it from some other data source. It belongs in another system. It belongs in another program, maybe on another computer, maybe on the cloud, maybe in a database on their same laptop, but you know. That's data. Then there's the stuff that belongs here. The stuff that belongs here is things like we are looking at this analytics thing. We are not taking a picture. But another part of the data is, hey, we have these 4 things that you could be looking at. Geo, something, pictures, and people, I guess. It is, you are now looking in this one little screen at this part of the data. When you keep on swiping over, that's, okay, now we're seeing the first bit of this thing. You are now looking, your screen is over here and you are looking at this person's information, right? It is things like maybe the data hasn't loaded up yet and we're going to show you a loading spinner. It is, hey, you actually asked for an operation and that's running right now. It is things like you are not actually signed in right now, or that is you are signed in right now and your name is Madison, right? So that is stuff about the experience that people are having, and that information is going to be on volatile memory in your app. We're not storing that stuff anyplace else. It belongs right here. It is just describing your experience. So 2 types of data, 2 types of info. So data and kind of experience. Or we might call this intelligence and experience. I say intelligence not like how smart you are, but intelligence in the military sense of like the information that you've captured, right? You haven't missed much, don't worry. We're just talking. So, how do we change state? Well, we have actions. And actions should be app specific. It's not just this button received a click event. It is the delete button for this item was clicked. So we are requesting a delete. So e.g. a request to delete an item, right? Yeah, they are also kind of instantaneous, generally speaking, but they may also, they will trigger, they may trigger changes to states, and they may also trigger basically processes. They may start processes that produce other actions. Okay? So this is the language we're going to use. We're going to talk about state and actions. Now, I want to show first, because I think that this is a nice little, I think this is a really good segue to Redux, is just understanding how state management works by itself. I have found when I've taught Redux that when I start with Redux, everyone's eyes glazes over immediately and remain glazed over until I am done talking. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about state management first. I'm going to show you some state management first, and then we're going to show how Redux does the same thing. And I'm going to show you that with the container pattern. Has everyone seen me do the container pattern? Have we? If you don't remember it, then good. I will say, all right, so let's start with a little app here. Yeah, and then let's do a create React app. Incrementer. So let's let that do its thing. So we are going to make the minimal React app of an incrementer. And we're going to take it through a few different stages, including eventually making a Redux app for it. Okay. Here's create React app. All right, so what I'm going to do here, I'm going to go to my source. I hope the screen's big enough for everybody. And in my app.js, I have all this stuff. Don't need that, don't need that. Actually, I'm going to leave that as is. I'm going to make a simple incrementer. Right, and this is going to say, obviously import React from React. I'm also going to say to import the container from React. Class simple incrementer extends. Not container, component. I'm a dum-dum. Component. And we're going to render, a return, a div, and it's going to have 3 buttons in it, or a button and a little readout. So button plus span style equals border 1px solid that thing button minus. And we're going to be reusing this over and over for our examples. Export default class simple incrementer. Cool, cool, cool. Now in my index.js here, I'm going to say, instead of import app, import simple incrementer from simple incrementer. Okay, there's our app. Which I may just say here, index simple incrementer style equals font size 3M. Is that going to be sufficient? That's bigger, certainly. Okay, none of these buttons followed suit, so I'm going to style. Font size is going to be 1M. Oh, there we go. Okay. There we go. Now this doesn't do anything. Just in case you're like, yeah, but when's it going to do anything? It hasn't done anything yet. If you feel like it hasn't done anything, you are correct. I'm going to also make this width, I don't know, 10M, margin 0 auto. At least now it's kind of more to the center. Let's make that 5M. Cool. So we have our basic application, our basic like view, right? And of course, what I want to do is I want to increment this. So I have to start with constructor. And this is where, of course, I put my state. This dot state equals count 0. And this is going to be the only place that I put my state, right? Or the only place I say this dot state equals anything, right? Cool, cool, cool. This is now going to be this dot state dot count. All right. And now, if we look at this in the React, we'll see that, yeah, this is 0, and this thing has a state of count 0. All right? We're all cool with this so far. This has kind of been pretty straightforward. All right, now what we need to do is we need to, this is our state. So that we have set up our state, but we haven't set up any actions yet, have we? So what actions are we going to have that are going to change the state?
We're going to have a function that increments the...
All right.
Probably two functions, one for adding, one for subtracting.
I can live with that. Increment and decrement. And these two should both change the state somehow, right? So what should increment do?
This dot set state and add 1.
Sure. And there's two ways I can do that. I can say count is this dot state dot count plus 1. Another way I can write this, and the way I'm going to kind of write these as I go, is that that's a shorthand for a more functional way of doing this. This dot set state, and then I'm going to pass in something that's going to take in the old state and say return count old state dot count plus 1. I don't have to put anything else in for the thing, but just in case my state gets any more convoluted than this, which it probably won't, I'm going to say copy everything from the old state except for the count, which should now be this, right? So you're going to see me using this more often, but this is an example of state to new state, old state to new state. And we are not mutating the old state, we are giving out a new state. And this really, one of the things I really like about this functional approach is that it's very clear what it's doing that. It is saying, given that old state, here's what I should expect.
Is this the container you're talking about?
Not quite yet.
Oh.
Not quite yet, but we're going to do the same thing here. -1. This button's on click is now going to be this dot increment, and this button's on click is going to be this dot decrement. All right, fair enough. Now, it doesn't seem to actually work because it says cannot read property set state of undefined. And why can't it read property set state of undefined?
This dot.
Yeah, because of binding. Whenever you see, pretty much in React, whenever you see cannot read blank of undefined, there's a good chance binding happened. So always look for that because that's like the easiest win, right? There's this thing I kept on realizing with the iOS students as I went past. I had no idea what was going on with them, but it seemed like whenever they were like, "Oh, it's an outlet," and so what I did after a while is just be like, when they had a problem and they look confused, I'm like, "Is it an outlet?" And they'd be like, "Oh, it is," and then they would. I have no idea what that means. It has been explained to me. I do not understand. Do not need to. But this is an easy win. Be like, hey, just check this. Check your errors to see if it's a cannot read property. This, right? So what we're going to do here is I'm going to do this form of binding. This dot increment equals this dot increment dot bind this. This dot decrement equals this dot decrement dot bind this.
You attached it on the click?
Yeah. So yeah. And now what basically happened is that the version of increment for this particular object isn't this sort of abstract one. It's very specific to me, right? So now, did I save that? No, I did not. So now, right? Okay. I might say on this one.
Wait, why does the style always have to be 2 brackets?
Because it's a style object that I'm passing to the. Yeah. One of those is a curly brace. One of those curly braces that it's an object. One of the curly braces is that it's dynamic JSX, right?
Yeah.
With 3M, text align, client information, no. Center. Okay. Why aren't you any? Maybe I have to say style, or not style. There we go. I hope that looking back on this, the fact that I'm using styles in here doesn't make this too hard to read, but I just wanted to have a little bit of space here. All right. So this is our app. Now this one component. This is where this comes in. This one component has all of our state management and all of our presentation. Now we don't have a really complicated presentation. We don't have like, oh, this and this, and we don't have a bunch of things copied out. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to CD incrementer, CD source, and I'm going to copy simple incrementer.js to incrementer container.jsx. And the thing about this is that it's going to be very similar. I'm going to go to my index. I'm going to say incrementer container. So I feel like this is where the actual lesson starts. This is us actually doing some things. So what we're going to do is, if we look at this in the React tab right now, what we see is the simple incrementer, and we see div, style, button span. So we have, this has state, and then here's our presentation. Okay, I'm not sure why it's right. Okay, so I'm going to call this. Sorry. Let's get that out of the way. Okay, so we have the class incrementer container. So the container pattern. The container pattern is simple. I even put in the quote, the block quote, if a component manages app state, then its render function should return one component with that state and actions passed as props. So let's do that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to, just for right now, I'm going to make a presenter, function incrementer presenter. And it is going to return, well, it's basically just going to return all this stuff, right? Now, you guys have seen a functional component before?
Yeah.
Like this part we're all cool with? We're all a bunch of little Fonzies? All right. So, what I'm going to do here is for this to be a container, what I really need to do is return one component. So my entire thing is just one line returning one component. Return incrementer presenter. And what I'm going to do, right now, if I do this in the front, it's going to lose its absolute shit. Button on click, this dot increment cannot read property increment of undefined. Is this a binding issue? What's happening? So what's happening is that this needs to actually come from here. Instead of being this dot increment, it's going to be props dot increment. Instead of this dot state dot count, it's going to be props dot count. And instead of this dot decrement, it's going to be props dot decrement. And what we're going to do is we're going to pass those items here. So now here's my state. Count equals this dot state dot count. And increment equals this dot increment. Decrement equals this dot decrement. So now we're back to this, right? And it still works. But what you'll notice here is that here's your container and here's your presenter, right? All that stuff being passed down to this. Have you guys, okay, so you guys have seen out in Launch Academy, do you know who Alinka is? She's a grad of the program, Romanian, she's about like this tall. What's kind of cool is that when if you are in Launch Academy and she is nearby, you should go and meet her first. And if someone's like, what languages do you speak? You can be like, well, I took French, speak English, obviously. Oh, and I know a little Romanian. She's over there. Her name's Alinka, because she's short in Romanian. I love that joke. All right, so what we do is, and she rolls her eyes every time, because it is. So she was working on a React app that she had inherited, and she had one component that was 490 lines long. And I was like, she's like, I don't know how to make changes to this. I don't understand this code. And I feel like once I change one thing, it makes this other thing fail. And I was like, well, yeah, this thing is barbaric. So I said, well, let's do this for step one. Let's use the container pattern. So it's like we wanted to break it into smaller components. And my first thing I did was the container pattern. Was basically, I was like, let's find all of your state. Let's find all of the things that change that state. And let's just kind of make those one things. And one other thing that I'll end up doing is I will have kind of one more step in this. Might be what can sometimes be called a selector. And a selector just basically formats, organizes, or analyzes the data for consumption. So your data might be like, for instance, your data might be a bunch of flat objects, and your selector might sort of organize them and nest them and make like bigger interconnected objects out of them, right? Your selector might format a few things together. Your selector might be about internationalization. For instance, it might take your currency and turn it into the different forms it has to be. Your format, like there's a bunch of different ways you would do that. And so that's part of what a selector will do. Okay. So another step we had was a lot of writing selectors. So there's a password field, and the password it has to be 8 characters long, has to have a special character, has to have a uppercase, a lowercase, and a number, right? And so what we wrote was something that's like, okay, so we have all of those. When someone changes the password, we're going to add those errors, and then we're going to have something called password valid, and that function just returns true or false. That's a selector, something that takes the existing information and organizes it so that we have a sense of like, we're able to kind of make more interesting information about it. So so we're not using a selector in this exact example, but we may find ourselves doing that in the future. So, right. So this is now the incrementer container. This part is all about smart. This is managing state. This part is dumb. It has no idea about state. It is just being passed these parameters. So when you click that button, it sends a message up that says like, hey, that changed. And then it's like coincidentally, its count changes, right? But it has no idea about that connection. It doesn't have to. It doesn't have to know what it goes through. It just knows, hey, that changed and that's not my problem. So now, so one of the things we were able to do is we ended up separating that one file, and that one big component, into 5 different files. And each file was really small and readable, and she was able to kind of reason. We were both able to reason about what was going on. And from there, we were then able to actually like make meaningful changes to this code. We were able to be like, well, this obviously is unnecessary. This part's unnecessary. We could kind of make a few of those again. I see how this works, and I could kind of break this down into these parts. And we were able to actually clean up a lot of code. And this was a big division that helped us do that.
So the incrementer representation
Yeah.
right at the top, that'd be a child element of this.
Right.
Right?
Exactly. And that's exactly where this goes.
When you do a CSS, can you target the entire class? Say like dot incrementer container or something like that?
So what ends up happening is the incrementer container is an invisible, like it's not actually going to show up on my thing. So I'm not going to be targeting it with CSS because I don't care. It's not going to be visible. It's going to be an invisible wrapper around my visible stuff. Managing the state for it, but managing it behind the scenes. So this container will not be seen in SAS.
Yeah. Well, what about the one above? The one above
Yeah.
that you see in SAS?
Oh yeah, here we can add styles and class names and everything.
I don't mean doing it that way. I mean just doing incrementer presenter, like the whole object, like
Oh.
you know how
Okay.
in CSS.
Yeah.
Just do incrementer presenter, and then
Right.
just do CSS because you see that.
Okay,
that's
yeah.
done, right?
The thing is that incrementer presenter is not going to show up in the HTML.
Okay.
None of these are going to show up in the HTML. I'm not actually making new components, although there is an interesting conversation to be had about web components and Shadow DOM and Shadow CSS, because you will be able to make your own components. React is almost like there's a web components thing that's going to be kind of like how React works, but it's native in the browser, which is really exciting. And the Polymer framework is going to be kind of good about that. But that's another story entirely. Right, this set state count 0, return set state old state. So yeah, now we have the container pattern. We have a separation of our state management. If you understand how to do this, you are halfway to Redux. And in fact, what we're going to do is now, we're going to take a coffee break. And when we come back, we are going to animate this up with Redux. And we're going to go through how this logic will map onto Redux logic. Okay? I'll see you guys back here in 10 minutes.
That's sick.
Right, it's for the third presentation.
He made
I just don't. Got it.
no CSS in
I don't know. So,
React Native import technology, and you use that. Oh, sorry, class. And you use that class to
file? File.
you can you make a separate file that just
I've done. Closest.
but it is like
Yeah, you can do object. Holy shit. They have to
door never really wants to close. Miss it in its absence. Okay, let's get to the biscuits. Okay, so Flux. Redux is a Flux implementation. There was a library, I think there's a library called Flux, and then there's been a few others. MobX, there's another one, and there's just a few that are Flux implementations. And it's a Flux implementation if it works a certain way from the outside. And the outside is this. You have a store and you have a view. The store is responsible for the data management, kind of like our container component, right? That store has state, which it then sends to the view. So that's kind of the data down part, right? The view is representing the data it gets from the state. And what happens is that when you interact with the view, it sends an action to a dispatcher. So it kind of like, this is similar, data down, actions up. You see that same pattern here? This may seem a little bit weird, but how it kind of like, basically we call store.dispatch action. And as a result, there are changes made to the state. Then the state updates, the view updates. Make sense? And it's in a cycle. We get state info, someone makes an action based on that state, the action goes to the dispatch, a change to state happens, and the state causes the view to update. And somewhere in here, the dispatcher is probably going to talk to an external API, at some point. With Redux, they kind of break it down into these patterns. So there is a state, but it's the reducer that actually does. Just in case anyone's wondering what's happening, Handsome Samington is violating a lot of workplace safety regulations. He's also very tall. All right, so that is how this is going to work. So let's talk about the reducer for a moment. The reducer is a function. So Redux is Redux, the Flux pattern, I'll include a note for that. So with Redux, it has a reducer. Now, a reducer is a function that takes in the old state plus some sort of action object and produces a new state, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to make a reducer. We're going to, we're going to go here. I am going to add in my source a folder. Am I going to add a folder or am I just going to add a file? You know what? I'm not even going to add a file. So I'm going to say, I'm going to do a couple things. First is I'm going to break this increment container into two files. Incrementer container, incrementer presenter.jsx. Now I'm going to do that for a reason, because I'm going to reuse that presenter. So that is going to go here. Import React from React. Export default function incrementer presenter. And here I'm going to say import incrementer presenter from incrementer presenter. Right? So now what's also cool is this is just a file about state management. And our app still works just fine, even though we made that change. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a file called Redux incrementer.jsx. And it's going to give us a couple of things here. Or no, not... well, I'm going to put this all in one... yeah, I know what I'm going to do. Okay. I'm going to put this all in one file. So Redux incrementer.jsx. So what I'm going to do is the same way that I have the incrementer container here, right? And this has the state represented as the state of a component state. And this has the actions represented as methods of that component, right? Well, I'm going to do the same thing here. I'm going to have, I don't have to bring in any library stuff for right now. So I'm just going to say function increment reducer. And it's going to have a state and an action. And what I'm going to do is I am going to start with an initial state, const initial state equals count 0. And I'm going to say, hey, state, if you're undefined, initial state. Now this is an identical, saying that that's the initial state is identical to saying, hey, this dot state is count 0, right? This is another setting of initial state. We're all kind of cool with that? We're all a bunch of little Fonzies? And what we're going to do is we're going to do things with the actions. And for right now, we're going to have increment action is just going to be an object of type inc. Const decrement action is going to be of type dec. That's it. And I'm going to make a switch statement here. Switch action dot type. So the action, the fact that I'm calling it an action object and an action type is really, that really comes from just a convention that people use. You don't have to do it this way, but you're going to see this sort of code quite frequently, where we have a string-based, where we have an object with a type string. So, so my default action, the one that means don't change anything, is going to be returning the old state. That's the last thing I'm going to do when it comes to that.
And can you just write if and else then?
I could. I kind of want you to get used to the switch type, and then there's different versions of this that you could do, but yeah. So if it's inc, I'm going to return, well, whatever my, I may even write this as old state. Dot count plus 1. You made it. I also love how you are both wearing Mario shirts. Did you call each other this morning? Was that a thing?
Tuesday's Mario Day.
Tuesday's Mario Day. All right.
I don't know what it's like to be a project partner.
Apparently, no. Wow, we were always doing it wrong. Maybe that's why all my group projects in schools didn't do so well. Okay. So count is now old state dot count minus 1.
Would you have to break that statement or no?
Huh? No, I don't have to break it because I'm returning. Returning gets out of that. So you'll see how this maps directly onto, hey, if I increment, do a this.set state of this. If I decrement, do that, right? So it's the exact same logic. Cool. So now that's my reducer. And that is, again, state plus action equals new state. Right, so what I am going to do is I'm going to kind of do all of my Redux stuff in this one file. What I generally do, and what we'll do in part 2 when we get to this on Thursday or Friday, is I will show you how I actually structure an app that's a little bit bigger. We'll be taking the to-do app and making that happen. All right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring in a couple of things from Redux. So, well, just one thing from Redux. So, oh, for one thing, I need to actually yarn add Redux.
Can you use Redux with some like Angular or something?
Oh my goodness, yeah, you can use, that's a good question about using Redux. You can use Redux with anything. In fact, when I'm doing WebSocket stuff that has like a bunch of interactions, I often will use Redux for that. And then again, use the presenter pattern. Use the like for instance, I was doing a card game, and so my WebSocket had to deal with like here is all of the like it has every card in the deck, right? It knows what every card in the deck is. But I don't want to send that to everybody. If we're playing poker, you should not know what everybody's cards are. But if I'm keeping track of the state of the game, I should know what everybody's cards are, right? So what I would do is I would, like when somebody made an action, I would check to see like, hey, was it their turn and is that an action they could make? And if it was, then I would change the state. But I'd make sure to just send, like you would only get, here's your 2 cards, here's what everybody has bet and like what money they have on the table as well. And here is what cards are on. And like here's whose turn it is, right? The information that you are supposed to know, I'm going to make sure that's the only thing you know. And so I would use again, a selector to sort of like just narrow down what it was you're supposed to see. So, yeah, yarn start. So yeah, Redux is generally very useful. Okay, and what I'm going to say here is, so I have my initial state, I have my actions, I have my reducer. This is enough for me to make an app. So I'm going to say import from Redux, and I'm going to import something called create store. Now, for the time being, I'm going to say is const store equals create store. I'm going to pass in the reducer. What did I call that? Increment reducer. Yeah. So now I have a store. And what I can do here is I can just say, hey, console.log store.get state. I can say store.dispatch increment action and console.log store.get state. So this is me just using Redux on its own. I am going to go back to my index.js and just say, hey, import Redux incrementer from Redux. Actually, I'm not even going to import anything from it. I'm just going to say, hey, import. And that's going to run. Okay, so now that I have that, I can see on my console here, get state count 0, and then I dispatched an action, and the count is now 1. All right, we're kind of okay with that? That's how Redux works on its own. I can get the state, and I can dispatch actions. Another thing I can do to this is I can subscribe to it. I can be like, hey, let me know when the state changes. So those are the 3 things I can do with a Redux store by itself. I can, once it's created, all I can do is get the state, dispatch an action, and subscribe to it, and also unsubscribe. Right? That's pretty simple. In fact, let me do.
What does the create store function do?
So the create store function, well, I'm not sure how to say this, but it creates a store. It creates a store object, and that store is going to maintain all of the state that we're passing to it, right? And so what it's going to do is it's going to set up that initial state based on what we told it what the initial state was. And then it's going to handle when somebody sends me an action, I'm going to do some stuff. When we get back to this, it's also going to be dispatching like API actions, and maybe it's going to be dispatching AJAX calls. Maybe it's going to be talking to a socket. Maybe it's going to be doing some other stuff too, based on the actions we send.
Yeah.
But for the most part, right now, it's just going to it's going to do that. It's going to have a state. We're going to be able to dispatch actions, and based on the actions, it's going to update itself based on that. So, yeah. All right, so we have store.getState. So this is just us being cute, right? Now what we need to do is we need to actually wire this into our app. So what I'm going to say here is yarn add, is it React Redux? It's either React Redux or Redux React. I guess we're going to find out. I think that's right. And what we're going to do is we're going to import a couple things. We're going to import two things that are going to matter. The first is going to be a provider from React Redux. And the idea is going to be this. So you can see how there's like the action, the dispatch updates the reducer changes the state. We don't have any middleware right now, so that's fine. Although we could put in the logging middleware, but I'm going to get to middleware later. Okay? So there's that. And this is how it works actually in the thing, is that we're going to have a provider that wraps around our entire app. And we're going to attach the store to that. And then what we're going to do is we're going to make components that are tied to this store. This is where it gets hairy. I'm going to be honest with you. This is where this is the part where you can't just sort of like scan and blank out. This is where it gets real. You guys ready for this to get real? All right. So here's what we're going to do. Do a couple of things. One is I am going to import incrementer presenter from /incrementer presenter. Okay? And what I'm going to do, incrementer presenter, how much state management logic does it have in it?
Wait, is it an incremental container?
No, we're replacing the container. So how much state management logic does the presenter have? 0. What is the point of the presenter? To display it, right? It displays it, and then it might send up actions, but it doesn't know what it's doing. It's getting everything from props. It's getting it wired into it. It has no kind of logic of its own. It's just getting information from another manager, right?
I meant to say that it's incremental container the file, right? You're as you said, increment presenter.
Right.
Is that the right file?
Yes. Because what we're going to do is that Redux is going to be the state management. Because the container itself is a state management mechanism, right? So Redux is going to be the state management, and we're just going to wrap it around our existing presentation logic. So there's a couple things we have to do. We're going to make, so this is going to be, I'm going to actually just go back to this real quick, just so we remember how this is working from the React standpoint, right? Here's the container, which has a state of count, and it has all those methods for changing count. And here's the presenter, which has had that state and the methods to change it passed to it. Those are the things we care about. So what I'm going to do is I have to have something that says, hey, given the state from Redux, how do I want this to look? So I'm going to make a function called map state to props. And it's going to get in state from Redux, and it's going to do something. Now, the only thing I care about right now is count. So I'm going to say return count is state.count. Now, I will also say that there is a bit of delightful ES6 goodness that I can do here, right? That I just loved this when I found it, and I was like, oh yes, 6, you are adorable. So const map state to props equals takes in the state and return count state.count, right? Well, I can take that state and do a destructuring, right? Const count equals state. And that means I can turn this into count count. Which means I can just put count. Which also means that I can take this and put it right in the props itself. And because of the way arrow functions work, if all my arrow function does is just return something, I can get rid of those arrows and the return. So my map state to props function just looks like that. This is the same as that. All right, so now I'm going to do the same thing with dispatch to props. I'm going to get, let's do that in a regular function, map dispatch to props. This is just me being silly, by the way. We'll keep this guy because it's a little more readable for you guys. So map dispatch to props is going to be how I define my actions up, if that makes sense. So I can return 2 things. I'm going to pass for props. What are my 2 functions that I'm going to pass to props? Increment and decrement. Which I can write as just this, because again, object shorthand. Now I have this dispatch. This dispatch is the store's dispatch. This is how I get actions into it, right? So what does it mean to call the increment method here? Within the logic of Redux, what does that mean? I'm going to, starts with the D, it's on the screen already.
Dispatch.
I'm going to dispatch an, right, well I'm going to dispatch an increment action. And then the reducer is going to take that action and make the changes to state. So I'm going to,
Dispatch is like a middleman.
yeah, the dispatch, not this dot increment. Sorry, it should be dispatch increment action. And decrement is dispatch decrement action. Okay? So I'm going to dispatch these 2 things against the store. Now, all I have to do is now write basically the container logic. A connected, basically, I need to make a component that is connected to the Redux store. And so I'm going to bring in provider and the connect function. Again, I told you this was hairy. I'm so sorry. It's going to make sense when we actually see it on the board. So const connected incrementer is going to equal connect. I'm going to pass in map state to props, map dispatch to props. And then I'm going to pass in incrementer presenter. Now I know this looks absolutely banana sandwich. I get that. We're going to make this make sense in a second. I'm going to export default incrementer, so default function Redux incrementer. It's going to have a provider that just says, hey app, this is your Redux store. Store. That's all that has. And then I am going to pass the connected incrementer. Okay, I know this has been a really long walk and we haven't seen anything actually working yet. I get that. So what I'm going to say is import Redux incrementer from Redux incrementer. And I'm going to say Redux incrementer. This should. Oh, I need to say yarn start. React must be in scope and using JSX. That is fair. That's a fair criticism. I see what you did there. Okay, so now we have the exact same app. But what is actually happening? Well, we have a provider. A provider has a store with dispatch, subscribe, get state, all that good stuff, right? So that provider is wrapping around my entire app, which means that I can make Redux connected things that talk to this app anywhere down the line that I want. Which is pretty cool, I think. I like it. And now what I can say is connect incrementer presenter. So now this is a connected thing that has a context of a store and a store, no store subscription though. And it is doing exactly what increment container did a moment ago. In fact, I think what I'm going to do in my index.js here is I'm going to bring in all these guys. Import simple incrementer from simple incrementer. I'm going to say React.fragment, just so I don't have to make another frickin' div. And I'm going to say simple incrementer incrementer container and Redux incrementer. Right? All right, so now we have our three incrementers doing their three very different things. The simple incrementer just has its own state that it's holding, you know, and that changes. Doesn't pass it down to anything. The incrementer container has a separation where the simple incrementer, we look at the file, it's a bunch of state and a bunch of presentation. If we look at the incrementer container file, there is state management and no presentation logic at all, right? Just return that. So now that has that the presenter that's actually getting the count, and when we move that, we can see that prop change because those decrement and increment are being called. And with the Redux incrementer, we have a provider with a store that wraps around everything. We have a connected component that's like, hey, I'm getting my data and I'm dispatching my actions to the store. This is managing my state for me. If we were to...
So that store is available anywhere on the tree? Anywhere down? Like
yeah, anything within the provider, we can make it available. With anything in the provider, we can use the connect to actually like say, okay, now pass me the dispatch and the state, and I will be able to affect that. I'm going to add something called Redux Logger real quick. It's going to be a middleware. We'll get to what that means later days. I'm going to say apply middleware, import Redux Logger. And I'm going to, now when I add this to the store, now when I create the store, I'm also going to say And when I make changes, now I actually have a log of what's being changed, what the previous state was, what the action, what the next state was, right? So this is all going through my reducer, and I can see that, and I can see all the changes being made. Okay, so that is handy, especially if I'm doing something that's just getting actions from everywhere, and I can be like, hey, what happened? I can do test-driven development on my reducers really, really easily. I don't have to mock up anything else. I just be like, hey, given this state and this action, I should get this new state. And if it's like, yeah, I get you, then we're good, right? Okay, so what I've just shown you is total freaking overkill. For us to make a simple incrementer, these are our dependencies. Create, store, apply, middleware, logger. Okay, technically that was just me doing some default. Provider, connect, and then the presenter, like that. So we had to bring in a lot of libraries. This has the most imports of any of our implementations so far, right? Everyone else just has like one, maybe two. This one technically has two, I guess. Right? So lots of stuff we brought in. We created a state, two actions, a reducer, a store, a connected component, and a provider to increment a button gen. This is madness, right? How could this possibly be useful? So there is an answer to that. And the thing is that at this scale, the correct answer is you don't need Redux. I really recommend using the container pattern, like everywhere, wherever possible. That makes total sense, especially when it's like app logic kind of reducer. So if you go to the Redux.js code, or like if you go to the Redux.js documentation here, here's all this stuff: intermediate concepts, real-world usage, and there's a before proceeding further. So he basically has a warning label on this that has an article written by the author of the Redux library called "You Might Not Need Redux." Do you feel me? That is like one of the most important things you can know about Redux is you might not need Redux. So what I really recommend is starting with the container pattern. But with the container pattern, we saw that because we had separated our state management from our presentation using that, I could just grab the presentation from my container manager implementation and use it immediately, right? Like we all saw that. I didn't like black out for a little bit and think that's what I saw, right? So that separation is important. If that's all you need to know about Redux, that's all you need to know about Redux, right? You might not need Redux. And so I want to take a moment and just kind of focus. Good heavens, it's a dark room. I might turn on a light so I'm not just backlit by my own screen. Okay. So what I'm going to say is now a bit of a philosophy piece that I have. This is taken from my own experience. This is not a thing I have read. I'm going to tell you something that is pure Joel talking about his limited experience in the least scientific manner possible. In my time as a programmer, I have the apps I have built have presented me with 4 kinds of complexity. And one of them I only really realized this morning. It required a thing. So the 4 kinds of complexity that I want you to be on the lookout for. The first one is wordy. Wordy means that it has a lot of words. Wordy means that it has a lot of things that it's talking about, you know? You can imagine like a real estate sales pipeline that has like, oh, we're building these developments. We have condos, but we also have renovations we're doing on houses, and also we have some developments that are in progress in the calendar. Also, we have renovations going on, and also we have contractors, and also we have construction. Also, we have sales. We have a sales team. Also, we have customers. Also, we have sales places that are open, and we're keeping track of that. Also, we have our... So you can see like just the number of things to keep track of. Even if none of them are particularly complex, just the fact that there are a lot of them creates complexity, right? The second type is tangly. And that means when a customer comes into a location, we want to know who they talk to. We want to be able to have them for our marketing stuff. We want to be able to know what they were looking at this time. They talked to this person, and they talked to this person, and they came to this sales. Also, they have this going on. They have this. So one entity may be connected to 4 or 5 different types of entities, right? Which are all interconnected with each other somehow. You talk to a salesperson who actually belonged to this group, but he was in our office here for a reason, right? And so where does the sales go? What connection matters? Does this count for this department's sales or for this department's sales, right? How do these connections work? How would you do like a LinkedIn degrees of separation? That sort of thing. That is tangly, where it's the links between them that are really hard to keep track of. A good example of this is often like doing classes, like in a university, because it's like, well, we have the class and we have the thing, but this person go to many class. This, a class has many students. Students go to many classes, so then we have to make more and more. Like, okay, well, there's instances of a class, right? There's this class running at this time, yeah, but we still have a many-to-many relationship, and someone might drop out and take it later, and also they need the grade, right? The third is wiggly. And wiggly is when it just never seems like things are quite the same way for the two groups of data have the same thing. It's just like, oh, we have an inventory system, and when you do this, it has to go through this. But if it's a printer, it actually has to go through Mark and IT. And when it's a this, it has to go through this person. And actually, if you're getting something that has any kind of environmentally, that it has to go through our environmental what's it, and then it has to have this, and these sorts of things. Anyone in marketing has to have this sort of certification, but everyone who's in IT has to have this certification unless they already have this certification, in which case that's actually interchangeable. And it just seems like there's always one small bespoke rule for every single weird situation. That is wiggly. And the fourth one, for which I do not have a term handy, is the kind of thing that reactive programming was meant to change. I guess volatile is the word I'm looking for. Where it's always subject to change. Where it has events that are coming in that are causing a change quite frequently. Where it's like this happens and this happens and this happens, and the state has a bunch of events that are coming in, and it's just frequently subject to change. Volatile. Volatile is a good word for this. It's very slippery. Well,
Maybe that's like wiggly though.
manic, perhaps. Fickle. What's the word? What's the word that I'm looking for? Where something is frequently changing. Not sapphireous. It's capricious. But I will not use capricious. Volatile is a good word. Where it's just like it's always changing. And you never know when something's going to happen, and then your state's going to be totally different. You need a different situation, right? Or it's like you think you have it done, but this is happening. And you have this process going, and you're like, cool, when I start this, then I'm going to start this process. But something could happen that interrupts it, right? So I find that if you are in any of those situations, Redux may help. If you find yourself in those situations, it's a situation where it's like, look, my world is unpredictable, and I need it to be predictable. Redux could really help with that. It's if you have some, like I write games. When I write games, I usually write them as reducers, right? Game logic, because a reducer is such a great way of testing arbitrary things. You should not be able to make a move when it's not your turn. You should not be able to play a card that is not in your hand. And I can make a bunch of test cases that's like, okay, so putting down a card. If you're trying to do a card that's not in your hand, you can't do it. If you're trying to do a card when it's not your turn, you should not be able to do it, right? I should only let you perform certain actions when it's when it's your turn, right? That's a good example of wiggly, right? Very arbitrary rules in games. The same action at different times is going to produce, these are going to be inadmissible or produce very different results. You can only move a pawn forward 2 moves on its first, like 2 steps on its first move, right? That is a wiggly rule. So if you find yourself in that situation where it's like we have any of these types of complexity, Redux can really help. Redux is predictable state management because you can write tests for it. And you can just make sure, like, hey, this absolutely does what it's supposed to do. If you don't have that, you might not need Redux. Okay, so what I have not shown you in this particular demonstration, there's a couple of things. The first is that we have not done anything of any kind of scale. I have not done form input and validation, that sort of thing. I haven't done anything that's like, I haven't done test-driven development on a reducer, which would be a really good thing to show. And I have not shown you, a reducer is meant to be, one of the things I guess I should make a point of is this. A reducer is meant to be pure, a pure function. Does anyone know what a pure function is?
That it has one purpose.
It has one purpose. That's a good example. It has one purpose. It has a simple input and a simple output. The really definition is it's deterministic. It is synchronous, and it performs no side effects. So that means that side effects are changing the state of the world in some way. There are things like sending an API request or updating a database or even console logging. Right? That is meant to be kept out of your reducer. No side effects. The second is it's deterministic, which means that for the same input, it always gives you the same output. Math.square root, for instance, should be deterministic. What happens when you math.square root of 4 should give you 2, right? Math.square root of 9 should give you there we go. Math.square root of negative 9 should give you 9i, but that's another story entirely. Math.square root of 4 should give you Math.square root of 4 should give you Math.square root of 4 should give you, there we go. If it gives you 3, that's non-deterministic behavior, right? So no side effects, no randomness, and then no asynchrony. It should be like just synchronous. It might give you a promise that's asynchronous, that is asynchronous, but it's synchronously returning a promise in that sense. Those are, but the thing is, like, don't you want those in your app? Does that mean we can never use Redux for a card game? Right? Because that's non-deterministic. How do you deterministically shuffle a deck of cards? You don't. You don't. It's the very point of it is that it's stochastic. It's always changing. I'm really hoping that that's what stochastic means. I'm now trying to remember if it also means deterministic or if it means the opposite. Yeah. I was told many times, and then I could have had those backwards. It's kind of like how the word sanction means both things. You know, you lift sanction, but you can sanction something. I don't know. So yeah. So what happens is that it doesn't mean we can't do these in Redux. It means that we use something. Oh yeah, and also, by the way, asynchronous. Don't you want to do API calls? Like, isn't that a thing you'd want to do? API calls? Does that mean you have to do all your API calls outside of your Redux app? And basically, there's a place for all that dirty. All that dirty, dirty business. And that is middleware, which is kind of the next step, and it's kind of where Redux then takes. Once you're cool with everything that we've done so far, this is where Redux takes its next step. This is where Redux kind of becomes what Redux becomes, right? Is being able to manage this, and there's some really cool libraries for that. So those are the things we do next, is that we take basically that to-do app, rewrite it with Redux, do some test-driven development, and then also use middleware to be able to include our async actions. So if you are interested in more Redux, if you're interested in finding out these next steps, I can do that. Otherwise, I can do stuff on CSS layouts. I don't think I got the entire room here for the vote. Who wants more Redux on Friday? Thursday or Friday? Who wants CSS layouts? Maybe we have 3, 4, 5. All right. Let me put it this way. I don't know. People are going to be saying things about other things. So if you don't get one of those talks between now and then, I'll do that. I do find that CSS grid will be or CSS disk layouts will be a little easier to digest. I would rather not give you a lecture that you're like, cool, and then you fall over and die. I would rather give you one that's actually going to be
Useful for the projects too.
well, useful for the projects and also stuff that you can actually like digest and use. Because I find with Redux, a lot of it doesn't make sense until you've used it a few times. And if you're not using it in your projects, maybe your brain power is best spent elsewhere. Yeah, Calgary, let me know what your vote is on the Slack, and then I will get back to you. So yeah, so I think we'll plan to do the CSS. I am willing to do a breakout on the rest of Redux later, and I'm willing to even pipe that out to Calgary if we have people who are interested. Although it'll be later in the day, and you guys may be like tired. All right. Okay. Cool. Are there any questions? Calgary? All right. You guys have a great day.